How many times have we been here?
This is too much tragedy.
Another deadly police shooting.
Shot down in the back like a damn animal.
Another senseless homicide.
Okay, is this all right spot for people? All right, is everyone ready?
Earlier this evening at approximately 5:30.
Only the names change.
I can't breathe.
The choreography always seems the same.
And back your cameras up.
History repeating itself like a broken record.
What happens when you shoot black men?
And why so often does the grim cycle take place here on the Northside? Every street, every neighborhood has its story. What we call North Minneapolis is in fact 13 separate neighborhoods covering 5 square miles, bordered by freeways. And on streets like Plymouth Avenue, the wounds can run as deep as the pride.
Oh, wow. Holy moly. Well, that's a stunning view.
This is not the view you normally get from North Minneapolis. This is the new headquarters for Thor Construction, one of the largest African-American owned construction companies in the country. And they've come home to Plymouth Avenue. More than a glimmering corporate headquarters, the hope is it'll be a catalyst for change.
Then you actually get into the gym itself.
Half the people who worked on this $36 million project were people of color. When completed, it will be home to 6 African-American CEOs.
When people say North Minneapolis has challenges, they're talking about the people. And we flat out disagree with that. The people are the assets of this community. They are resilient, they are innovative, and we made an investment because of the people here. "50 years ago, and just a few blocks east, it was a much different picture of Plymouth Avenue. The businesses were Jewish-owned back then, but for the growing African-American community, the opportunities were few.
It was hard to just walk on Plymouth. You know, the merchants would call and say those so-and-sos are on the avenue, cars would come, where you going, what you doing? Just walking down the street, you know, was welcome on the street.
The summer of '67 saw racial unrest in cities across the country. On the night of the Aquatennial Parade, it was Minneapolis's turn.
That particular night, word filtered down as the parade was ending that a Negro veteran had been shot. Some, you know, obviously some people saying had been killed, and et cetera, and et cetera.
Well, when you bring that gurney out and his hand fell off that gurney, it went up. They set Plymouth Avenue on fire.
How do you go about fighting a fire like this?
Well, we just surround the fire with a lot of lines.
Over 3 nights, more than a dozen businesses burned.
Don't go near any of them. Stay away from them.
Hundreds of National Guardsmen were called in. The papers called it a race riot. Others saw rebellion, an uprising against oppression. One thing was clear: North Minneapolis would never be the same.
And I believe people have always been afraid of us. I mean, even friends can be afraid.
Josie Johnson was a liaison between the young people on Plymouth and the city's Jewish mayor, Art Naftalin.
What I'm dealing with here is not a North Side problem as such.
So I think our Jewish brothers and sisters moved out of a community that was becoming identified as a troubled area.
The riots were frightening.
How much do you think 1967 changed the North Side?
It changed it a lot because there were a lot of Jewish people living in North Minneapolis before that. When I came in, actually in 1968, there was still Desnick Drugs, if I believe it was on Plymouth and Penn, and there were many other places there. It was a more integrated community then, but the flight had become intense. And so, yes, it changed it dramatically.
Whites began leaving North Minneapolis, relocating to the suburbs, an exodus that's continued in the last 30 years, the white population declining 60%,
the black population increasing 62%. Today, roughly half the North Side is African American, compared with 19% citywide. But the division is deep. Median income for whites in Minneapolis is almost 3 times that of blacks. And unemployment on the North Side nearly 3 times as high as the rest of the city.
And then you look at what happened after the riot. Plymouth Avenue burnt down. Did those businesses come back?
No.
They didn't come back. Broadway, did those businesses come back? They didn't come back. But what did come back was the liquor store, the gas stations, the folks from another country that sell us gyros and all those things. Now, and I'm not putting them down, it's just that that's what came back. We didn't come back.
When it comes to geography and race, there are few accidents in America. In 1910, Minnesota was booming, and it was very, very white. A quarter of the population were newcomers born in Sweden, Germany, and Norway. Less than 1% were African Americans.
All kinds of people lived on the North Side. Jews, people from Eastern Europe, Swedes. The segregation that we're living with today was designed. There's nothing preordained about it. It didn't just happen naturally.
It was accomplished through so-called racial housing covenants, their locations seen on this map in red. Researchers at the University of Minnesota have uncovered more than 15,000 of these documents, language literally written into property deeds prohibiting the sale of land to any colored person or person of Negro blood. From 1910 through the 1940s, racial covenants created a kind of American apartheid, restricting where African Americans could live.
The places that had racial covenants are still the whitest places in the city.
The Fair Housing Act of 1968 made housing covenants illegal, but you can still see their impact today in neighborhoods like Bryn Mawr behind me, which was loaded with housing covenants and remains predominantly white to this day. But cross the bridge here into the Harrison neighborhood of North Minneapolis, where there were no covenants, and the majority are African American. The only thing that separates these two neighborhoods is a bridge and a history of racism.
Highways like Olson Memorial sealed the deal, decimating African American businesses and effectively sealing off the North Side from the rest of the city.
By 1952, the African American or Negro economic base was gone.
Racial covenants would set the stage for redlining, when banks would literally outline minority neighborhoods like near North in red as hazardous for investment. Redlining was also outlawed in 1968.
Okay, so this house over here is boarded up. I want you to look at these things.
Wow.
You see how nice this house is?
But 50 years later, Queen Kimmons finds it hard to imagine what's really changed.
So is this empty or is this?
Queen is a housing advocate who watched in 2008 as North Minneapolis became a hunting ground for predatory lenders with subprime loans. Housing values plummeted, credit was shattered, sucking the wealth right out of neighborhoods. The foreclosure dots lining up almost perfectly with those old redlining maps.
Because if you don't own anything, you can't change anything, right? So you should be aspiring to put people in these places.
In Minneapolis today, 75% of whites are homeowners, 25% renters. Those numbers reverse for African Americans. 70% are renters, only 30% own a home. It's one of the widest gaps in the country.
What is it condemned for? Code and compliance.
Queen tracks more than 300 vacant and boarded up homes the North Side, most owned by people who don't even live in North Minneapolis. This place is owned by someone in Minnetonka. Sometimes the owner doesn't even live in Minnesota. In the last 4 years, a Georgia company, Havenbrook Homes, has bought up 222 single-family homes, turning them into rental properties. Almost all the homes are in North Minneapolis, and more than half
in the 55412 zip code.
If the renter is Section 8, the landlord will take the highest amount possible for Section 8 when it could be over 3 times the amount of what the mortgage would be per month.
The reality is home ownership is how most Americans create wealth, wealth that is often passed from one generation to another. But African Americans in North Minneapolis have been largely left out of that equation. From housing covenants to redlining to foreclosure, the legacy of the maps is hard to ignore.
You know, there's always that map you can go back to that says that this was the area where Negroes lived and this was part of the slums. We are still having these issues 50, 60 years later. We still in the same position.
Coming up, violent crime, reality versus perception.
He's got a gun.
And what it really means to protect and serve on a Northside at a crossroads. For too long, and for too many, the picture of North Minneapolis has been framed by yellow crime tape, a narrative that's played out for decades on the nightly news.
A Minneapolis police officer was shot and killed.
A developing story in North Minneapolis.
Out of North Minneapolis.
Live in North Minneapolis tonight.
On what happened here in North Minneapolis. I'm standing on the corner of...
So we don't look at the good. You don't highlight that. You never highlight. Tom Lyden, you've been doing this for so long. I have not seen one story where you've highlighted a family that came in from Chicago and is doing great things because your producer is telling you not to do that.
So I've been covering news in the Twin Cities for about 25 years. And if I'm honest with myself, I'd have to say in North Minneapolis, most of that news has been crime news. Especially back in 1995 when we had nearly 100 homicides. The New York Times labeled us Murderapolis. And I don't think I'm the only reporter who did this, but I think a lot of it was sort of drive-by journalism. You stop, you report on the homicide or whatever violent crime happened, you talk to witnesses, and then you're out of there. You never learn anything about the neighborhood. And I don't think a lot of reporters know the difference between the Hawthorne neighborhood, near North, Camden. It all just becomes the blanket North Minneapolis. And unfortunately, I think the coverage has sort of reflected that. And it's really created a stereotype for a lot of people.
We would never just describe all of South Minneapolis as uptown.
Right.
But we describe all of North Minneapolis as north.
Right, right.
I wonder if that speaks to something. And I don't know what.
With simplicity. The camera takes this view, the reality is this, you know.
But it's not just perception. More than a third of the city's violent crime last year took place in North Minneapolis. In the last 20 years, out of 875 homicides citywide, nearly half were in North. Looking at that same data, the Washington Post found homicides in Willard Hay and near North were some of the least likely to be solved. And yet even the cops who patrol the North Side,
remember, we don't touch guns or bullets or anything, right?
Say crime is just a single note in neighborhoods that should sound more like symphonies.
There's a lot of people that don't trust us, and what I find is once they get to know you, once they get to see the human side of being a police officer instead of the guy with the sunglasses and the stern look, they realize, oh, I can talk to this person is just a person trying to do their job, and they do just mean well.
So we'll start in there, walk around.
Yeah.
For Officer David Mattson, whose father was also a cop on the North Side, that means getting out of his squad car. Not to bust the dope dealers hanging on the laundromat, but to connect with the people there. Something you can't do if you're always chasing 911 calls.
To me, I feel as if the police is the biggest gang in America. It's not that we don't like the police, it's just that the police don't communicate with the community. They don't come out like they used to.
You see, I have a problem with people telling me what I can and can't do, and cops is like known for that.
Put your hands up now!
You can see the disconnect in the police shooting of Thurman Blevins, a 40-second Rorschach test.
Where police see a threat, a man with a gun,
Put your hands up! Put your
others see a man afraid, running for his life.
Shots fired, one down.
I'm gonna have to start doing some real complicated calculus about whether or not I want to call the police, right? Because I'm still fearful to confront them, but I'm also measuring, is it a big enough deal for that person to be slammed on the ground, arrested, harmed, potentially shot, right? That's not the kind of calculus that social calculus that I want my neighbors making.
You can't say that Black Lives Matter only when a white person or a white police officer shoots and kills a black person.
No one knows both sides of crime quite like Sharif Willis, a former top leader of the Vice Lords.
I mean, I have nothing to do with any kind of drug sales. I don't allow individuals to come into my house.
26 years ago, he was a founder of United for Peace, a group that worked to reduce gang violence, until it all fell apart with the murder of Minneapolis police officer Jerry Hoff. Sharif Willis was suspected of ordering the hit. His nephew and 2 others were convicted in the killing. He says today some of the community's wounds are self-inflicted.
There's this concept of don't snitch. It's not snitching if one of these kids walking down the street and they see somebody lay back and shoot their classmates. And then you put that burden on them to say, oh, you snitching if you so. That's not snitching. Good citizenship starts with people being responsible, and as communities have to lay back and take a stand and say, this is something that's unacceptable in our neighborhood.
The landscape of gangs, which Willis calls social organizations, has also changed. They're younger, without loyalty or leadership, and disputes are less about drugs or turf than disrespect, more likely to begin on YouTube than a street corner.
So I had about 11 guys come in here, and they had guns that weighed 20 pounds with great big extended clips that was making them walk as if they were crippled down their legs. And I said, what's this about? And one of the guys said, Sharif, we're fearful.
You want a kid to trust you, you have to show them love.
Corey Dean has seen that fear close up.
What do you think young men need that they're not getting right now?
Love.
Dean is the founder of a program called Man Up, a mentorship program for young men trying to break a vicious cycle of poverty, violence, and incarceration. Sometimes it begins with a charge as simple as marijuana possession. In Minneapolis, blacks are 9 times as likely as whites to be arrested for low-level offenses.
Well, many people have asked me this as if we have some type of secret sauce. Our secret sauce would be one-on-one relationship, and it really would be love. You'd be surprised to ask African-American males, young African-American males, how many people in the course of their life or in the course of their day that has literally looked them in the eye and told them that, hey, I love you.
Coming up, change is coming. But will it be real progress or gentrification for Northside at a crossroads?
So when you come in, you'll come through this door, and then there'll be another door that actually is the front of the gym itself.
Jeffrey Scott is a homegrown entrepreneur trying to make it happen on the North Side.
And I just really want people to see the community that I grew up in, right? Not the one that's portrayed on the news necessarily.
A former vice president in the financial services industry, he's come back to North Minneapolis to open a gym, the only one in the zip code. But even with his finance background, the banks took a pass.
We actually have the resources in the bank to pay the loan. Why aren't you willing to invest? While you're telling me this is an area that you want to invest in, but then you're not doing it when our business plan shows you we can be successful. So is it that you're redlining? Is it that you have this perception of the area?
He's hardly the only one asking that question.
How is it that I can get a loan for a car, I can get a loan for a house,
but I can't get a loan to open up a business.
There's a Sammy's Coffee on West Broadway, but good luck finding a Starbucks. There's fast food everywhere, but there wasn't a decent grocery store until the North Market recently opened.
The number one thing that's been evident when people walk through this store has been pride. That they've felt community ownership in this solution. They've saying this is what North Minneapolis deserves. This is what it needed.
The winds of change are blowing north, and maybe more quickly than anyone imagined.
The Northside is on the brink of mass displacement, and because all of the signs are there.
The city is considering a 2040 plan that would increase housing density along major streets. And there's a plan to turn a desolate, post-industrial area along the river into an entertainment venue with a hotel, apartments, and concert amphitheater. But when the city talks change, others hear and fear gentrification, that African Americans will be pushed out.
For me, it feels like a slap in the face to see $15 million go towards developing the riverfront with false claims that it's going to benefit the people of North Minneapolis, and all one need do is drive down an area that is already established like West Broadway, and we can see very clearly the lack of economic investment.
I also think it's a mindset. Like poverty is a mindset.
Rashida Jenkins believes she's found a path others can follow. A single mother at 17, she went through an apprenticeship program to become a carpenter.
That could not have been easy.
No, it wasn't easy, but nothing in the world is that's worth something.
Rashida was lucky enough to buy one of those vacant homes. Even after the foreclosure crisis, more than half of mortgage applications in near North were denied, the highest rejection rate in the region.
I get up at 4:30 in the morning. You know, a lot of times I'm out of the house before they are. You know, and a lot of times I don't get home till after they're home. And they see that their mother works hard, their father works hard. And that says something to a child when you're living in an environment where life is hard. You got to start at home. You got to start with the babies.
That's the philosophy behind the Northside Achievement Zone.
There's no one else I'd rather be.
A nonprofit trying to end generational poverty through early education and family support.
To help our children learn.
Programs with proven track records. Minneapolis has one of the largest achievement gaps between whites and students of color in the nation. Students fall behind before school even begins because of high poverty and low expectations.
Transportation in many cases is a barrier. Housing in many cases is a barrier when families are moving consistently and children can't remain in the same school. That's a barrier.
In North Minneapolis, the future often repeats the mistakes of the past. Community centers have become police stations. Housing projects replaced by planned developments. Business districts torn down for highways. Today, North is truly at a crossroads, as investments are made not just in buildings, but people, as neighborhoods look for a new way to be served and protected. Perhaps now is the time for North Minneapolis to chart its own course, to decide where it wants to go, how to get there, and what it truly is meant to be.